Hey guys, tonight we wander down the uneven, sun-warmed streets of Pompeii, that Roman town forever frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The stones beneath your sandals are grooved by countless cartwheels, and every step feels like an echo of footsteps from nearly 2,000 years ago. You can almost hear the chatter of vendors, the jingling of coins, the calls of hawkers selling figs or olives. And yes, you're heading somewhere you probably won't survive in modern polite company if you brag about it afterward, a brothel. It's not as glamorous as your imagination might suggest, but it's certainly more vivid, more raw, and more strangely ordinary than you expect, so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through Pompeii's grid of narrow streets, lined with modest houses and noisy taverns, past bakeries where carbonized loaves still rest in ovens to this day. The town is alive around you, donkeys bray, children dart between alleys, and the smell of fish sauce, garum, wafts from amphorae stacked in shops. Amid this bustle, something catches your eye, crude graffiti scratched onto a wall, hinting at services of a more personal nature. You pause, tilt your head, and smirk. That little scrawl of Latin shorthand is essentially a 2,000-year-old Yelp review, complete with bragging rights and not-so-subtle hints. As you move closer to the heart of town, you realize this place is compact, only about 160 acres, yet crammed with life. Amphitheaters, bathhouses, temples, all within reach. And tucked in the shadows of this busy Roman grid, there's something else, buildings marked not by towering marble but by faintly suggestive drawings. Historians still argue whether every symbol of a phallus carved into the stone was a direction marker toward a brothel, or just an everyday good luck charm. Either way, you follow the trail like an ancient scavenger hunt. One carving points down a street, another leads you past a tavern where sailors sip sour wine, and another steers you toward a more discreet lane. The Romans were pragmatic about pleasure, after all. They didn't exactly wrap their morality in lace. Instead, they tucked it behind modest facades. As you approach, you can feel the hush of the crowd thinning. Not everyone wants to linger near this part of town, unless, of course, they have business here. You glance at the buildings, many are crumbling or ordinary in appearance. Paint flakes from plaster, shutters creak in the hot breeze. And yet, if you slow down and look closely, you'll notice certain doorways attract more attention. A merchant, feigning interest in a fruit stall, keeps darting his eyes toward a side alley. A pair of young men snicker nervously as they slip away from the main street. And there, barely visible above a lintel, is a faint painting that makes you double-take. Your first laugh bubbles out before you can stop it. The Romans weren't shy with their artistic signals. No written sign reading open in big neon letters, but a painted phallus. That'll do the job. Some scholars think these cheeky markers guided illiterate visitors who couldn't read, while others suggest they doubled as symbols of prosperity and fertility. Either way, the effect is the same. You're standing in front of a doorway that promises more than bread or olive oil. And you start to wonder about the people who walked here before you. A traveling merchant, weary from weeks on the road, pockets jangling with coins. A soldier back from a brutal campaign, craving the softness of human company. A young man, perhaps nervously fumbling through his first paid encounter. Their shadows seem to brush past you as you stand on this same dusty street, aware that human desires haven't changed much in 2,000 years, even if the settings have. It strikes you that Pompeii was unusually candid about sex compared to the prudishness of later centuries. Erotic paintings decorated dining rooms, mosaics showed playful scenes, and inscriptions weren't shy about naming names. Still, don't let the humor fool you. The reality of these encounters was often bleak. Many of the women here weren't free to choose this work, they were enslaved, trafficked from across the empire. That mix of casual acceptance and stark exploitation makes the story heavier than the chuckles of bawdy frescoes suggest, but you keep moving forward, sandals clicking softly against the stones. Around you, Pompeii's daily life swirls on. A woman balances a jug of water on her head. A man barters for grain with a loud gesture. Children chase a stray dog, laughing. You realize that, for them, the presence of a brothel wasn't a shocking scandal, it was part of the urban fabric. Ordinary. Normalized, almost invisible. The sun dips lower, washing the plaster walls with a warm glow. Shadows stretch across the stones, making the carving stand out more clearly. You feel that strange blend of curiosity and hesitation. You found the street, the markings, the quiet cues. You're standing just outside a small, plain building that doesn't look like much at first glance. Your hand brushes the rough wall as you prepare to step inside. For a brief moment, you pause, thinking about how this exact doorway has seen thousands of men like you pass through it across the centuries. Some with excitement, some with guilt, some with no more thought than if they were buying a loaf of bread. The air feels heavy with that history. With the invisible residue of footsteps long gone, and then you lean closer to the unassuming facade, catching faint whispers of laughter from within, or maybe just the echo of your imagination. Either way, you're at the threshold, heart beating a little faster, ready to slip inside Pompeii's most infamous lupanar. You stand before the brothel exterior, and at first glance it's almost disappointingly plain. The building looks like any other modest house or shop along the narrow street. The plaster is faded, chipped in places, and the doorway is low enough that even you would need to duck to step inside. You half expect marble steps or a velvet curtain, but no. If you didn't know better, you might mistake it for a bakery or storeroom, and that's the point. Roman brothels weren't palaces of decadence, they were small, practical, discreet. To a passerby, it's just another building in Pompeii's crowded streets. But if you linger, the markers show, above the doorway, a faint painting, cheeky, unmistakable male anatomy. Romans liked their direct symbolism. Historians debate whether such images advertised brothels or served as charms, but here, with men slipping in and out, the meaning is clear. Faded frescoes also cling to the wall, once colorful, maybe enticing, like a signboard. Romans rarely used euphemism, bread painted on bakeries, wine on taverns, and here, well, the doorway itself is shabby. The wooden door, long rotted, once swung on iron hinges. You picture sailors pushing it open, merchants brushing dust from sandals, locals glancing over shoulders before ducking inside. The low lintel forced each man to bow, in humility or simple necessity. You glance up. The roof tiles are plain clay. Nothing gilded, nothing showy. This place never needed neon, it relied on word of mouth, and graffiti. Sure enough, the wall bears scratches, names, boasts, even crude reviews of services. Pompeii's walls doubled as bulletin boards, love notes, insults, poetry, ads. You wonder how many men chuckled at these etchings before stepping in, whether written by customers, rivals, or the workers themselves. Meanwhile, life flows on around you. A cart creaks past, children chase each other, a woman wrinkles her nose at you loitering by the door. Ordinary life outside, whispered transactions within. You trace the wall, stone rough under your hand, as though it still remembers the eruption's heat. The air carries dust, olive oil, and the tang of garum from a tavern. You close your eyes, oil lamps flicker, coins clink, laughter spills. It's tempting to imagine glamour, but reality was harsher. These were working-class places, efficient, unadorned. The plain facade mirrored the simple rooms and stone beds within. Still, the weight of history presses close. Thousands must have crossed this threshold, leaving coins, graffiti, memories. Just before you duck inside, you pause. Behind you, sunlight and chatter. Ahead, dim lamps, secrecy. This doorway is a boundary between public life and private indulgence. You inhale, steady yourself, and step across. You lower your head and step through the doorway, leaving the brightness of the street. Inside, the air shifts, cooler, quieter, lit by oil lamps in clay sconces. Footsteps echo faintly on the stone floor as your eyes adjust. This is no villa atrium with fountains and mosaics. It's modest, functional, yet charged, as if the walls remember everything. The entryway is narrow, almost claustrophobic. You brush past plaster worn smooth by countless hands. The ceiling presses low, the floor rough, dotted with fragments of mosaic. A lamp flickers in an alcove, its smoke mingling with traces of perfume, sweet, musky, resinous. Somewhere, laughter echoes, or perhaps it's only the acoustics. You move deeper, past a hall branching into tiny rooms. Each doorway is narrow, forcing you to twist your shoulders to peer in. Once inside, privacy and business blurred together. Historians debate whether the cramped design was practical or deliberate, but you sense intimacy was part of the point. Your fingertips graze faint frescoes, reds and ochres clinging to plaster, mythological scenes and geometric borders. Once they blazed with color, catching lamplight. Even here, decoration set the mood. Shadows shift with the lamps, guiding customers into a maze that feels half stage, half marketplace. A niche bears a painted phallus, symbol, marker, or talisman, depending who you ask. Blunt Roman advertising, not so different from a modern emoji. The corridor opens into a slightly larger room, lit by a high window. You picture men waiting here, coins in hand, shuffling toward the side cubicles. And the workers, mostly women, sometimes boys, many enslaved, brought from across the empire, waiting in dim rooms, listening for footsteps, resigned or fearful. You lean against the wall, imagining muffled sounds, bed frames creaking, voices low, coins clinking. Outside, this was just another house. Inside, every sound carried weight. Further in, the enclosed design becomes clear: no open courtyards, no street-facing windows. A self-contained world, sealed from Pompeii's bustle. Perhaps that secrecy was part of the allure. The silence now feels thick, heavy with memory. This was more than business, it was a theater of desire, where countless private stories unfolded, and you smirk, picturing men leaving with hearts racing, only to bump their heads on the low doorway, Pompeii's small reminder that even lust bowed to architecture. You move deeper down the corridor, and the shape of the place emerges, a row of tiny cubicles, hive-like cells. Each no larger than a closet, bare stone walls, a low threshold, and at the center a raised masonry platform, the bed. At first glance it looks like a sarcophagus lid, but once held a thin straw mattress or blanket. You run your hand along the surface, gritty, cold, still unfriendly even now. Historians debate whether these permanent stone couches were standard or unique to Pompeii. Some say they were more durable and sanitary than wood, others think their immovability underscored the transactional nature, never home, never personal. You peek inside the cubicles, nearly identical, though a few still bear traces of red paint or fresco vines. Imagine lying there, staring at fading scenes while the stone pressed cold through straw. Curtains may once have hung across the doorways, but sound carried, walls were thin. Privacy was promised but never complete, voices mingled, echoes overlapped. In one cubicle, faint grooves scar the stone, maybe tool marks, maybe wear from years of use. A small mystery left behind by some forgotten artisan. Moving from room to room, the repetition becomes hypnotic. The same couch, the same walls, the same function. Romance stripped away, replaced by efficiency. Yet here and there you glimpse attempts at warmth, a fresco, a splash of color, a lamp niche. Perhaps workers added their own touches, fabric, trinkets, charms against misfortune. Tiny comforts in cold rooms. You step back into the corridor. The cubicles face each other, customers brushing shoulders as they came and went, pretending not to notice. Silence, awkwardness, coins clinking afterward. The air feels heavy, your footsteps layering over thousands before you. A fleeting joke, Roman Tempur-Pedic, dies quickly against the chill stone. In one last cubicle, you pause. The bed stretches before you, the ceiling presses low, the oil smoke lingers. You imagine the scratch of straw, the hardness beneath. Comfort never mattered, only the transaction. Straightening, you step out. Behind you, the room closes like a stone cell, a preserved fragment of Pompeian life. Ahead, the passage draws you toward something more vivid, walls where paintings promised what words could not. You step out of the stone cubicle and look up, where the brothel softens its harshness with art. Above the doorways, frescoes in vivid pigment still cling after 2,000 years, flickering in the lamplight as if alive. These aren't random decorations but an ancient menu, panels of men and women in intimate poses. A nervous client might once have pointed to one, ordering like at a food stall. Historians still debate whether they advertised services or simply set the mood, but either way the message is unmistakable. The paintings are bold yet not crude. To the Romans, sex was part of life, no different from myth or politics. Villas displayed similar scenes, often mixed with revels or cupids. But here the imagery was stripped of pretense, direct, playful, clear. Leaning closer, you notice jewelry on a wrist, a cushion under a figure, folds of tossed fabric. The plain backgrounds focus all attention on the act itself. There's a strange elegance in the bluntness, and you can almost hear Pompeians teasing over which image seemed most true to life. Critics like Seneca and Juvenal condemned such indulgence, yet often participated themselves, reminder that hypocrisy is hardly modern. Some frescoes don't even match their spaces, sparking questions: were they painted as a set, or guides for the illiterate? No one knows. As you walk the corridor, the variety strikes you. Some scenes blaze with color, others have faded to ghostly outlines. You imagine how dazzling it must have been when new, walls glowing with images meant to guide and entice. It feels theatrical, cold stone beds below, painted fantasies above. The contrast makes you think of modern restaurants with glossy food photos, except here the dishes were people. You laugh softly, ancient fast food menus of desire, still waiting centuries later. The frescoes capture Pompeii's openness. Romans didn't hide sex, they painted it on walls. Ironically, later archaeologists locked these works away in secret cabinets, blushing where the Romans never did. At the corridor's end, a nearly vanished fresco lingers in faint ochre. The plaster crumbles, its figures fading into dust. You realize you're not just looking at Roman art but at something fragile, nearly lost. And you wonder if 2,000 years ago, some young man once stood where you are, gazing up with nervous anticipation. Now it's just you, alone, with their laughter long gone. You leave the painted corridor behind and step into a small courtyard-like space, where faint daylight filters in through the remains of a skylight. The shift feels strange, because here the gloom gives way to brightness, and for a moment you can breathe easier. This was the heart of the brothel, where air and light seeped down from the open sky. You pause, tilting your head upward, and picture how the sun must have fallen into this space, washing the walls with golden glow, softening the harshness of stone and plaster. It isn't a grand atrium like in a patrician villa. No fountains gurgle, no mosaics sparkle beneath your feet. Yet the architecture follows the same Roman principle. Always some form of light drawn into the house, always a space for circulation. Even in a brothel, practicality and design intertwined. You can imagine women lingering here between clients, gathering for a few minutes of conversation, leaning against the walls while listening to footsteps echo in the corridor. The courtyard would have been the closest thing to a communal area, perhaps where a keeper kept an eye on who came and went. The Leno, the manager or owner of the brothel, likely stood here often. He wasn't necessarily a pimp in the modern sense, but he orchestrated the business. Some owned the building outright, others leased it. Contracts for such places were drawn up and sealed just like for any shop. It was commerce, plain and simple, though its commodity was flesh. From here, you trace the way clients must have entered. You picture a man stepping through the doorway from the street outside, perhaps already flushed with wine from the tavern across the road. He'd shuffle into the courtyard, greeted by the faint smell of oil lamps, sweat, and plaster. If he were literate, he might read graffiti scrawled on the wall, boasts, jokes, insults, or even reviews. If not, the frescoes above would guide him. Either way, the atmosphere told him exactly what kind of building he'd entered. The graffiti here is particularly rich. Names are scratched in, sometimes alongside little phrases: "I was here," "Successus was here with Iris," or "One Zymus is the best." Some remarks praise, others mock. They read like a chaotic guest book, voices from 2 millennia ago, preserved in plaster. You trace one faint inscription with your eyes, barely legible now, and it strikes you as oddly human. 2,000 years ago, someone wanted to leave a mark, not unlike scribbling on a bathroom wall today, but beneath the chatter lies the unspoken truth, the lives of the women who worked here. They were most likely slaves, some captured in wars, others born into servitude. For them, this courtyard wasn't a place of fleeting novelty but the center of their daily routine. Morning to night, they waited here, watching customers come and go. Their days blurred together, punctuated only by the shuffle of feet, the clink of coins, and the brief escapes into laughter or gossip. The Roman state treated them as property, but the city treated the brothel as necessity. Pompeii had dozens of small inns, taverns, and private houses that doubled as makeshift brothels. But this one, the Lupanar, was dedicated entirely to the trade. It was structured, supervised, and taxed. In that sense, it stood at the odd intersection of legality and stigma, acknowledged, tolerated, even profitable, yet also whispered about, looked down upon, considered a step away from decency. You stand in the courtyard and imagine the sounds. Voices carry through the halls, a client bargaining, a woman calling out, the scrape of sandals across stone. Outside, the bustle of Pompeii continues, vendors shouting, carts rattling on the street, children laughing. But here, within the walls, there's a different rhythm. It is transactional, fleeting, and yet oddly constant. Every day the same, and every day a little different. The architecture itself reinforces that duality. The courtyard is open, airy, almost welcoming, but the corridors leading to the tiny rooms feel enclosed, heavy. It's a cycle: step into the courtyard, choose, retreat into a room, and return again. Life here revolved around that pattern, over and over. You can't help but think about how many different stories played out within these walls. Lovers' quarrels, awkward first-timers, grizzled veterans of indulgence, soldiers spending wages, sailors spending winnings. Each left some imprint, sometimes literal, scratched into plaster, sometimes invisible, carried only in memory. And now, standing here centuries later, you're surrounded by those invisible layers. Stacked one atop the other like invisible frescoes only time could paint. You glance back at the entrance, picturing the moment after Vesuvius erupted. Ash must have poured into this courtyard, falling through the skylight, coating everything in gray silence. Perhaps some fled, leaving the doors open. Perhaps others huddled here, choking, waiting for rescue that never came. That sudden halt, the brothel frozen mid-scene, allowed you, 2 millennia later, to stand here and imagine it all. You shift your weight on the stone floor and realize how little separates you from them. The same sun that once warmed those women's shoulders now filters down on you. The same walls that echoed with laughter, bargaining, and sighs now echo faintly with your breath. For all the time that's passed, the human traces cling stubbornly, refusing to be erased, and so you linger in the courtyard, letting the silence settle, before you move on deeper into the brothel, toward the narrow stairway that leads upward, where another layer of this strange building waits to be uncovered. You tilt your head toward the shadowy stairway tucked into the back of the building, a narrow stone climb that seems too steep, too cramped for comfort. You place your hand on the cool wall and trace the grooves where countless palms must have steadied themselves before you. One step, then another, you feel the slight sway in your knees, the claustrophobic sense of rising within walls too tight to belong to a place meant for leisure. Yet up you go, toward the small upper floor of the lupanar. The rooms upstairs mirror those below, but they whisper a slightly different story. Some historians suggest the upper chambers were reserved for wealthier clients. Others argue that maybe they housed the women themselves when they weren't working. There's no consensus, and the debate lingers. Whether these cubicles were for private rendezvous or living quarters remains unclear. What is certain, though, is that they were smaller and darker than one might expect. Imagine ducking into a low-ceilinged chamber, the faint light of an oil lamp flickering against plaster, revealing a crude stone bed built into the wall. A thin straw mattress might soften it, but not by much. The air here must have been stifling, especially in the heat of Pompeii's summers. You picture the glow of lamps fighting with the darkness, smoke coiling against ceilings already stained by years of soot. The women, too, must have carried the smell of lamp oil in their hair. Their clothing, their very skin. And as you stand in that room, your mind drifts to them again, not as painted frescoes or carved names in graffiti, but as living, breathing people with stories now lost. One fact that always lingers in these spaces is how diverse the women were. Inscriptions and names suggest Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, and even Germanic origins. Rome's conquests funneled enslaved women from across the empire into places like this. Some may have spoken little Latin at first, relying on gestures or the universal language of exchange. Others likely picked it up quickly, trading not only their labor but also snippets of foreign words, songs, or jokes that colored the atmosphere here. You run your finger across the wall and imagine the noise. Up here, the sounds from the street outside would drift in more faintly, the creak of a cart, a vendor's call, maybe the bark of a dog. Within, though, voices overlapped, men laughing too loudly, bargaining in half-whispered tones, women coaxing or sighing. Privacy was never complete, the walls were too thin, the rooms too small. Yet to a weary sailor or a lonely traveler, perhaps even that flimsy semblance of intimacy felt like a sanctuary. There's a quirky tidbit historians like to point out: some brothels in the Roman world reportedly kept lists of services almost like menus, and the upstairs frescoes seem to echo that idea. Each painting, placed above a doorway, depicted a different act. Modern scholars often debate whether these were instructions, advertisements, or simply erotic decoration. You stand under one of these frescoes, paint still faintly visible after 2 millennia, and wonder whether a client once chose his room based on the scene above it, like picking from a picture book. It's here, too, that you start to think about the economics of it all. A quick encounter in the lupanar cost roughly 2 asses, a coin worth less than a cup of wine. Cheap enough that even a soldier or dock worker could afford it after payday. But for a woman upstairs, working day after day, that meant dozens of clients just to meet the quota demanded by her keeper. The coins clinked, but they rarely stayed in her hand. Instead, they filled the purse of the Leno, who managed everything from rent to bribes to lamp oil. And yet, upstairs in this oppressive little room, you sense moments of stolen humanity. Perhaps 2 people laughed unexpectedly. Perhaps a woman sang softly under her breath to pass the time. Perhaps a client confessed his fears before a long voyage, and she listened, not because she wanted to but because silence weighed heavier. In such cramped quarters, fragments of real connection must have slipped in alongside the trade. You crouch low in the chamber and look at the floor. Ash and pumice buried this place so suddenly that even the smallest details survived: the grooves of sandals, the impressions of fallen beams, the scatter of pottery shards. When archaeologists uncovered it, they found oil lamps, small jars of perfume, even traces of straw bedding. Ordinary objects, yet each one tells you the upstairs rooms weren't just for anonymous encounters. They were lived in, however briefly, however bleakly, historians still argue whether some of the women lived upstairs permanently or rotated between shifts. If they did live here, the rooms doubled as prison and bedroom. Imagine closing your eyes in this very space after a day of endless transactions, trying to ignore the muffled voices from other cubicles. Your dreams would carry you anywhere but here, perhaps to the homeland you barely remembered, perhaps to a world where freedom wasn't just a rumor. You exhale slowly. And the room exhales with you, as though it remembers every sigh it has ever absorbed. Then you step back into the narrow stairwell, careful not to bump your shoulder against the rough plaster. The climb down feels easier now, your footfalls echoing hollow against stone. And as you descend, you realize that in this brothel, whether upstairs or downstairs, the line between survival and routine blurred until even the women themselves may have stopped noticing it. You step back into the main hall, brushing your palm along the cold wall as though to ground yourself after the cramped climb upstairs. The light is dim once more, flickering from oil lamps, and suddenly your thoughts settle on the exchange itself, the clink of coins, the silent slide of bronze across a rough palm. In Pompeii's Lupanar, money wasn't just part of the rhythm, it was the pulse that kept the entire building alive. The Roman world functioned on coins, bronze asses, silver denarii, gold aurei, each with its own weight and prestige. Most clients here weren't jingling gold, that was reserved for elites parading in marble atriums, not sailors staggering into a brothel after unloading grain. Instead, they carried asses or maybe a silver coin, and for the price of 2 asses, a fraction of what you'd spend on a loaf of fancy bread, you could buy a fleeting moment in one of those stone rooms. Some scholars suggest prices rose with demand, a quick exchange might be cheap, but special requests could cost several times more. Others argue the frescoes above the doors weren't just decoration but price markers, visual indicators for the semi-literate. Historians still argue whether those painted scenes served as advertisements or merely titillating art, but the placement feels just a bit too practical to be meaningless. The sound of coins must have been constant here. A man would shuffle in, slap down his asses, and move toward a chosen doorway. The Leno or Lena, the keeper, would scoop the coins into a small box or pouch, keeping careful track. Roman prostitution wasn't a shadow trade, it was taxable. Records suggest certain brothels were required to pay fees to the state. Imagine an accountant in some dingy office, tallying up earnings from dozens of lupanars, turning lust into neat rows of numbers. Somehow, the Romans managed to turn even passion into bureaucracy. The workers themselves rarely saw the benefit. Enslaved women handed over their earnings directly, their labor commodified as much as grain or wine. A lucky few, perhaps freed after years of work, might one day collect their own pay. There are rare inscriptions where freed women proudly record their names as former prostitutes who had made it to independence. Yet for most, the coins stopped in someone else's hand, proof only that the system kept grinding forward. You imagine the sensory part of it too, the rough texture of bronze, warm from the hand that carried it, and the faint metallic tang left behind. A merchant might drop his change carelessly, too used to the gesture to think twice. A soldier, perhaps, would count twice before parting with precious pay. And the women? They'd hear the clink and know the night had begun again. Coins weren't romance, they were the drumbeat of survival. There's an odd, almost comical tidbit tucked into Roman money culture. Some coins bore the image of the emperor, stern-faced and proud, and here those same coins might pass from sweaty hand to sweaty hand in a brothel transaction. Imagine Augustus' solemn profile being used to pay for 15 minutes in a smoky cubicle. The irony feels thick enough to taste. You might even smile at the thought, emperors immortalized on metal, unknowingly sponsoring the most ordinary of human exchanges. And yet, behind the humor lies another layer. For many clients, pain was reassurance. In a world where affection could be complicated, arranged marriages, family duties, strict social roles, the brothel offered something bluntly simple: money down, service rendered. No strings, no obligations, no awkward letters to write later. You give, you take, you leave. The transaction stripped away all the mess of intimacy, leaving only an exchange as straightforward as buying olives at the market. But the simplicity was deceptive. You can picture a woman weighing her customer silently, deciding whether to smile, to play along, or simply to endure. For her, the coin meant another notch in the daily tally, another contribution towards someone else's wealth. For the man, it was both purchase and proof that he could afford to buy pleasure, proof that he belonged among those who indulged. Status clung even to something as small as 2 asses, and the brothel keeper, hovering in the courtyard or leaning on the doorway, watched it all. He was businessman and overseer, balancing profits with control. Too much leniency, and coins slipped away, too much harshness, and workers grew desperate. Perhaps rebellious. His task wasn't to create joy but to maintain flow, coins in, coins stored, coins out. Even in Pompeii, a town often painted as carefree, someone always counted the money. You stand still now, imagining a night when the brothel buzzed with customers, every room full, laughter and bargaining spilling into the courtyard. The keeper would move like a shadow, collecting fees, keeping order. The coins would pile higher and higher, a soft ringing chorus beneath the human noise. And then, when the eruption came, when ash fell thick and fast, perhaps some coins were still sitting in a box, uncollected. Archaeologists have found stashes of such coins in Pompeii's ruins. Payment frozen mid-cycle, the last clink silenced by catastrophe, you run your thumb over the imaginary coin in your hand, its edge worn smooth by years of passing palms, and you realize that money was the true heartbeat of the lupanar. Not the frescoes, not the laughter, not even the intimacy, just the ceaseless clatter of bronze, the empire's most ordinary sound, echoing in the most extraordinary of places. You drift toward one of the narrow doorways again, pausing at the threshold as if you're about to slip inside. But instead of stepping through, you imagine the parade of men who once did. The lupanar wasn't a place for the elite of Pompeii, at least not regularly. It was the haunt of sailors fresh off the bay, merchants traveling the coastal routes, mule drivers stopping overnight, even local shopkeepers sneaking away from family duties. Each customer left behind not only a payment but also a fragment of routine, adding to the rhythm that pulsed through these walls. Picture the sailor first. Salt still crusts his hair, his tunic smells faintly of fish and tar, and his sandals carry the grit of the harbor. He doesn't expect luxury, he wants immediacy. 2 asses slide across the palm, and into the cubicle he goes, stumbling perhaps, eager to leave behind the endless rocking of waves for something solid and human. For him, the brothel is less about romance and more about grounding, a reminder that land has pleasures the sea cannot give. Then there's the merchant. He arrives with more swagger, his purse heavier, his toga maybe just a little too clean to be practical. He negotiates with ease, accustomed to weighing prices and services like goods at a stall. Some historians suggest merchants might have used brothels not only for pleasure but also for deals. Imagine 2 men striking a bargain over amphorae of wine or sacks of grain while waiting their turn in the courtyard. The lupanar, in this sense, wasn't just about intimacy, it was part of Pompeii's broader commercial web, and don't forget the locals. A baker, dusty with flour, might duck in after dawn loaves were set, slipping away for a quick encounter before customers lined up at his shop. A carpenter, shoulders stiff from hauling planks, could stop by, paying the same fee as the sailor, reminding you that here, class blurred. Coins spoke louder than pedigree. Whether you were a freedman, a trader, or a weary traveler, the transaction was the same. Still, not everyone approved. Roman moralists grumbled endlessly about prostitution, seeing it as both necessary and shameful. Philosophers like Seneca rolled their eyes at men who couldn't control themselves, while others argued the brothel prevented worse temptations, like affairs with respectable women. Historians still argue whether the Roman state saw brothels primarily as a moral safety valve or simply as taxable businesses. Either way, the customer flow never stopped. you imagine the routine from the worker's perspective. The door creaks open, another man enters. She sizes him up in a heartbeat. Wealthy or poor, sober or tipsy, generous or rough. Then it begins, a few minutes at most, and out he goes again, footsteps echoing back into the courtyard. The rhythm repeats dozens of times a day, a conveyor belt of human need. The monotony itself becomes the background hum of her existence. There's a quirky little tidbit here, some brothel graffiti in Pompeii reads almost like Yelp reviews. One carving boasts, Murtis delights with sweet service, while another sneers at a different woman's performance. Imagine trudging into a tiny cubicle only to find a review scratched on the wall by the previous visitor, a 2 millennia-old version of scrolling customer comments before purchase. It makes you laugh softly, even though the context is sobering. The customers weren't always men either. Ancient sources hint, though not very clearly, that women may have visited brothels as well, sometimes to meet male prostitutes or simply to explore outside strict marital expectations. Whether that happened often in Pompeii is debated, but the possibility lingers, a reminder that desire didn't follow rigid lines, even in Rome's rigid society. The atmosphere of the Lupanar must have shifted with the clientele. On market days, when the town swelled with outsiders, the rooms likely filled non-stop. On quieter afternoons, perhaps only 1 or 2 men shuffled in, leaving long silences broken only by the drip of water from a pipe. At night, lamps glowed, casting every wrinkle and shadow into sharp relief. The brothel never really slept, it just shifted gears with the town around it. As you stand there, you picture the mix of faces, the sunburnt sailor, the careful merchant, the flour-dusted baker, the soldier leaning on his gladius, even the occasional wide-eyed youth sneaking in for a first taste of adulthood. Each played his part in the routine, keeping the Lupanar alive, sustaining the constant cycle of footsteps, coins, and sighs, and just as suddenly, you realize how ordinary it all must have felt to them. To you, the brothel is a curiosity, a preserved snapshot of ancient vice. To them, it was Tuesday afternoon. No scandal, no spectacle, just part of the city's fabric, as unremarkable as buying bread or wine. That ordinariness is perhaps the most striking detail of all. You wander down another narrow corridor, the walls closing in as if reminding you that even in daylight, the Lupanar retains its intimacy. The air smells faintly of dust and oil, but now there's a hint of something sweeter, perhaps dried herbs or remnants of perfumed oil left behind by workers. You inhale carefully, letting the mingled scent settle in your mind. Each room you pass seems to hum with echoes, the quiet chorus of countless footsteps long gone but never fully vanished. This is where you notice the small details, the ones historians argue about endlessly. Some cubicles still hold traces of niches where oil lamps sat, their soot-stained walls like signatures from the past. Others show faint remnants of frescoes or geometric patterns that hint at fleeting attempts to add color or personality. Scholars debate whether these touches were purely decorative, functional, or even morale-boosting for the workers. You brush your fingers over one faded patch and feel the texture of time itself, rough and unyielding. The practicalities of daily life are everywhere, if you know where to look. Small ceramic vessels sit in tiny recesses, once containing oil, wine, or scented water. In one corner, a shallow basin would have served for washing, though likely more symbolic than hygienic. Life here was never luxurious, but Romans had a keen eye for organization. Even in a brothel, efficiency mattered. Workers, clients, and the keeper all moved within a carefully choreographed routine, one built to keep commerce flowing smoothly. You pause near a tiny room with a particularly low ceiling. It's so narrow you instinctively crouch as you step inside. There's a strange charm in the intimacy, the space forces proximity, compelling you to notice every detail, the worn stone beneath your feet, the faint scratch marks along the walls, even the remnants of a small fresco that depicts a pair of mythological figures entwined. It's easy to imagine someone once crouching here, carefully adjusting a lamp, brushing straw bedding into place, or exchanging a few whispered words with a client before the door clicked shut, a quirky detail catches your eye. Some cubicles have tiny hooks embedded in the walls. Were they for hanging garments, personal effects, or perhaps tokens of some ritual? Historians still argue about their function. You chuckle at the idea that something so mundane could spark centuries of debate, but that's the allure of Pompeii. Every scratch, every recess, every trace of plaster invites speculation, and no answer is ever completely satisfying. The human aspect becomes clearer when you consider the women themselves. Most were enslaved, yet some were freed women, and each carried her own story, her own strategies for survival. Many would have learned the art of negotiation, reading customers quickly, managing expectations with practiced smiles. Some likely cultivated personal favorites among the regulars, a subtle way to gain a measure of control over a life otherwise dictated by the Leno. Every gesture, every glance, was calculated, revealing a complex psychology that went far beyond the mere mechanics of work. You imagine the sounds, low murmurs, footsteps, coins dropping, overlapping with the occasional burst of laughter or a sudden exclamation. These walls, though silent now, absorbed everything, storing it in a way no one could hear, only feel. The structure itself seems almost alive, a vessel for countless human interactions, repeating patterns that stretch across centuries and then froze in the ash. And then there's the quirky reality of graffiti. Names, phrases, crude drawings etched into the walls like a Roman version of social media. You trace one faint carving that boasts, "Felix was here," and picture the original visitor, full of bravado, sliding the stylus across wet plaster. Wanting posterity, or at least posterity's equivalent, recognition among peers. Some inscriptions even make sly jokes or give ratings of performance. The human impulse to comment, to leave a trace, transcends time and circumstance. As you step back into the corridor, the low ceiling pressing gently against your head, you notice how the rhythm of rooms, lamps, and frescoes creates an almost hypnotic effect. One room mirrors the next, small and intimate, yet each carries unique traces of life, a smudge here, a niche there, the echo of a name carved centuries ago. You realize that even in a place devoted to fleeting pleasures, the persistent marks of human habit, curiosity, and creativity remain. Bridging the gap between the ancient world and your presence now, finally, you linger at the end of the corridor, considering the quiet resilience of this space. The rooms, walls, frescoes, and niches aren't just remnants, they are a preserved rhythm of life, commerce, and humanity. Standing there, you feel connected across time, realizing that Pompeii's Lupanar was more than its reputation. It was a stage where survival, desire, and ordinary life intersected, leaving traces both subtle and vivid for centuries to come. You find yourself drawn toward a narrow doorway at the far end of the corridor, one that seems almost overlooked. The walls here are slightly curved, the ceiling dipping lower, and the light from the oil lamps dances across plaster in a way that makes shadows stretch and twist. This is a different kind of space, not the crowded cubicles or the sunlit courtyard, but a small chamber that feels more private, almost secretive. You step in carefully, feeling the cold stone beneath your sandals, and immediately notice the faint aroma of wine mixed with resin. It occurs to you that the Romans weren't shy about combining business with indulgence. Some historians suggest that spaces like this may have been used for slightly more exclusive services. A higher tier than the standard rooms. Others argue that it might have been a retreat for the workers themselves, a place to rest, to escape the unceasing rhythm of clients. Historians still debate the purpose of these back chambers, but the evidence is tantalizing. Perhaps this was a space for whispered conversations, brief laughter, or even quiet reflection away from the constant transactions. The floor is scattered with small remnants, broken pottery, fragments of oil lamps, and traces of straw. You kneel to examine them, imagining a day centuries ago when the same floor bore the weight of sandals, bare feet, and hurried movements. The narrowness forces you to move deliberately. To notice details you might have missed in the larger rooms, the faint grooves where furniture once rested, tiny holes in the plaster for hooks or fastenings, even the occasional smear of pigment suggesting a faded fresco. One quirky tidbit stands out: archaeologists have found evidence that some of these chambers contain small containers of cosmetics, perhaps left over by women who lived and worked here. Lip pigments, powdered powders, even rudimentary perfumes may have been stored in these niches. You can picture a woman mixing a bit of color on her fingers, applying it carefully before the next client, adding a fleeting flourish of self-expression in a place where personal agency was often limited. The chamber is still, almost reverent in its silence. You hear the faintest echo of your own breath, and for a moment, it feels like the walls themselves are listening. You imagine the social dynamics: a worker stepping in here after a difficult encounter, perhaps speaking softly to a colleague, sharing a small joke, or just exhaling the tension of the day. These were the small moments that the larger narrative often overlooks, but they must have existed, quietly threading humanity into a transactional environment. In one corner, you notice traces of graffiti, different from the more overt scribbles in public areas. Names, small phrases, even symbols carved lightly into plaster. Some may have been signatures of visitors, others perhaps messages left by the workers themselves. The act of carving, of leaving a mark, seems universal. It's human nature, a tiny rebellion against anonymity, a whisper that says, "I was here. I existed." Historians still debate whether these markings were primarily personal, performative, or even superstitious. You look up and catch faint glimpses of what remains of frescoes along the upper walls. Unlike the larger, more explicit paintings downstairs, these are subtler. Geometric patterns, floral motifs, maybe even mythological hints. They suggest a touch of care, a deliberate effort to make the room feel less sterile. Perhaps it was the equivalent of modern wallpaper, something to soften the space, to remind its occupants that even in a utilitarian room, beauty or whimsy could survive. The chamber invites reflection. It makes you think about the interplay between work and humanity, duty and desire, commerce and fleeting comfort. Every scratch, every groove, every faint image on the wall tells a story, even if you'll never know its full details. You imagine the conversations, the laughter, the quiet sighs, and the moments of resilience, small acts of individuality that persisted amid the routines of daily life in Pompeii. You step toward the doorway again, feeling the chill of the stone underfoot, and pause. The lupanar, in its entirety, is more than the sum of rooms, beds, and frescoes. It's a living ecosystem of human behavior, an intersection of culture, economy, and emotion, frozen in ash and stone. Standing here, you realize that the private corners, the subtle chambers, and the whispered spaces offer perhaps the clearest window into what life truly felt like for those who lived and worked within these walls. You descend once more into the main hall, the warm glow of oil lamps flickering against the walls and casting long, lazy shadows. The air here feels heavier, almost tangible, carrying with it faint traces of centuries, dust, ash, and the subtle perfume of time itself. As you move along the corridor, you notice more details: the small indentations in the plaster where hooks once hung, remnants of painted lines, and faint scratches from countless hands brushing against the walls. Every mark tells a story, even if its full context is forever lost. The lupanar's design seems deliberately practical. Narrow corridors funnel movement efficiently, cubicles are built for function over comfort. And the rooms, though decorated with frescoes, are undeniably small. Yet within this efficiency, you sense the rhythm of human life, steps coming and going, voices rising and falling, the constant hum of commerce. You imagine a client hesitating at a doorway, glancing at the painted scene above, or a worker brushing straw bedding into place before the next transaction. Even centuries later, that rhythm feels almost audible, a faint heartbeat preserved in stone and ash. You stop at a small alcove, where faint graffiti lines the walls. Names, jokes, and crude sketches mingle with messages of longing or jest. One faint inscription reads, "Amicus memor est," roughly, "a friend remembers." And you can't help but imagine the writer chuckling as he carved it, leaving a piece of himself behind. Scholars still debate whether such graffiti was primarily playful, declarative, or even superstitious, but it provides an unfiltered glimpse into the human impulses that animated this place. A quirky tidbit catches your attention. Archaeologists discovered tiny cylindrical objects nearby, likely used as dice for games played in the courtyard or corridors. Roman prostitutes, much like anyone else in the city, found ways to entertain themselves between transactions. A short game of chance, a whispered joke with a colleague, or a moment of idle time, all of these small acts carved human warmth into the otherwise transactional space. You pause, reflecting on the juxtaposition. On one hand, the brothel is meticulously organized, almost militaristic in its efficiency. On the other, there are countless traces of individuality, graffiti, games, personal touches, that resist the rigid system. The women, many of them enslaved, exercise tiny moments of control, a favored client, a small token kept hidden, a laugh shared with a friend. Even within the confines of stone walls, human agency found a way to assert itself. From this alcove, you glance back toward the courtyard. The faint light spills into the corridor, highlighting the raised stone beds and the painted frescoes above. The colors are muted but still hint at the vibrancy of the past. Some historians argue that the frescoes were not only decorative but also instructional, guiding customers in a semi-literate society. Others contend they served purely as enticement, an erotic display to complement the functional aspects of the space. Either way, the artwork interacts with the architecture, forming a complex dialogue between form and function, art and commerce. As you continue your walk, you imagine the daily life in the lupanar. Clients arrive, women move with practiced efficiency, coins change hands. And life unfolds in repetitive but surprisingly human ways. The interplay of necessity and pleasure, of survival and small indulgence, shapes the experience of the building. Even the smallest rooms hold evidence of that rhythm, the wear in the stone beds, the faded frescoes, and the faint traces of activity in the corners. And yet, there's a haunting beauty in it. Despite the transactional nature, the lupanar was a space of living history, a snapshot of Pompeii's culture preserved in ash. It reminds you that human behavior, mundane, intimate, humorous, or poignant, can survive even the harshest circumstances. Every mark on the walls, every artifact, every whisper of color tells a story, not just of commerce, but of humanity persevering in the smallest, most unexpected ways. You step back, feeling the weight of centuries around you. The lupanar is more than rooms, beds, and frescoes, it's a testament to ordinary lives intersecting in extraordinary ways. And for a fleeting moment, standing in that quiet corridor, you feel a deep connection across time, to the people who walked, laughed, and labored in these very walls. You move toward the final corridor, the narrow stones underfoot worn smooth by millennia of footsteps. The air feels heavier here, infused with the memory of countless interactions, the shuffle of sandals, murmurs of voices, the quiet clink of bronze coins exchanged for fleeting pleasure. There's an almost tangible energy lingering, as if the lupanar itself remembers the rhythm of human life that once pulsed through it. You notice the walls along this corridor are particularly covered with graffiti, names, phrases, even small drawings. One inscription reads, "Felix loved her," another, "I return next week." These are not grand proclamations, they are intimate, fleeting, human traces. The kind of scribbles that bridge centuries. Scholars still argue whether some graffiti was intended as humor, flirtation, or simply a way to leave a mark for posterity. Either way, it's striking how the human impulse to be remembered transcends time, culture, and circumstance. The corridor narrows further, funneling you toward the small back rooms that feel almost hidden from the main traffic of the brothel. The plaster here is chipped and worn, yet faint frescoes cling stubbornly to the walls. One panel shows a mythological scene, another, geometric patterns. The subtle artistry contrasts sharply with the bare practicality of the stone beds. Perhaps these rooms were reserved for clients of slightly higher status or for private meetings away from the bustling courtyard. Historians still debate the exact function of these rear chambers, but the layered evidence hints at multiple uses: commerce, respite, even minor social maneuvering. You pause to consider the women who worked here. Most were enslaved, though a few may have been freed women or migrants seeking opportunity in the city. They carried the weight of survival with them, navigating client demands, managing time, and asserting small measures of control wherever possible. Imagine the cleverness required to maintain personal dignity and autonomy within a system designed for compliance. Even a brief smile, a small joke, or a favored client could offer tiny pockets of power, fleeting as they were. One curious detail: archaeologists have found small cosmetic jars and tools tucked into niches along these walls. Lip pigments, scented oils, and powder suggest that women made small efforts to maintain personal presentation, perhaps both for clients and for themselves. A wink of color, a dab of scent, a trace of individuality, reminders that even in constrained circumstances, human expression persists. The sounds of ancient life seem to echo faintly in your imagination. Footsteps approaching and retreating, coins clinking into a purse, a muffled laugh, or a whispered conversation. The lupanar operated like a self-contained ecosystem, each movement affecting the next. You imagine a client hesitating, choosing a room based on the fresco above, or a woman balancing efficiency with moments of humor or connection. The choreography was constant, yet invisible to those outside. As you walk through, you notice how the architecture subtly guides behavior. Narrow hallways, low ceilings, and strategically placed lamps create a flow that keeps people moving efficiently from courtyard to cubicle to back corridor. Even in leisure, structure dominates. Yet within that framework, traces of individuality, graffiti, decoration, tiny personal effects, punctuate the rhythm, humanizing a space built for routine and commerce. And then there's the fleeting, almost whimsical aspect. Some frescoes appear slightly out of proportion, perhaps painted quickly or whimsically. Scholars still debate whether these inaccuracies were intentional, for humor or effect, or simply the result of hasty work. Either way, they hint at the humanity embedded in the art, the same humor and creativity that the women and clients brought to daily interactions. Standing in the final corridor, you sense the layering of centuries. Ash-preserved walls and frescoes, coins, graffiti, and even tiny objects, all snapshots of ordinary lives, frozen in time. The lupanar is no longer just a place of commerce, it is a monument to the rhythms, improvisations, and small gestures that define human existence. Each element, no matter how mundane, contributes to a broader story, one that survives because of the meticulous preservation by time, ash, and attentive archaeologists. You exhale slowly, letting your gaze drift along the walls. Every mark, every trace, every faint scent in your imagination connects you to people who lived, worked, and laughed here, their existence echoing faintly across millennia. It's humbling, even comforting, to realize that ordinary lives leave extraordinary traces. You step back into the courtyard one last time, letting the soft daylight, or what remains of it, filter through the remnants of the skylight. The contrast between the shadowed corridors and this open space strikes you again. Here, you can almost hear the chatter of people mingling, the footsteps of clients and women moving between rooms, the faint scrape of sandals on stone. Even 2,000 years later, the rhythm of daily life hums quietly beneath the preserved ruins. The courtyard was more than just a passageway, it was a hub, a meeting place, and, in some ways, a stage. Workers paused here between clients, exchanging brief words, laughs, or complaints. The Leno kept watch, balancing oversight with the practicalities of commerce. Coins changed hands here, decisions were made, and the pulse of the brothel continued unbroken. Scholars still argue whether courtyard spaces were primarily social, functional, or a hybrid, but standing here, you can sense all three possibilities blending seamlessly. You notice the remnants of frescoes along the walls, some depicting mythological scenes, others geometric patterns or playful symbols. These weren't just decoration, they communicated messages, suggested options, and perhaps even entertained. Some historians argue that these images doubled as menus for clients, guiding choices in a semi-literate society. Others believe they were purely ornamental, meant to add color and vibrancy to an otherwise practical space. Either way, the artwork shaped the experience, subtly influencing behavior. There's a quirky detail: small fragments of writing etched into the walls suggest the presence of humor, commentary, and personal expression. One reads, "Lucius is clumsy," another, "I will return tomorrow." Imagine stepping into the courtyard and seeing these faint echoes of past visitors, almost like whispers from the past. You chuckle softly, realizing that while coins and commerce dominated the space, human quirks and emotions seeped in everywhere. The sounds of Pompeii's streets would have filtered in as well, the distant calls of vendors, the clatter of carts, perhaps even the occasional stray dog barking. The courtyard acted as a buffer, a liminal zone between public and private life. It connected the intimate rooms of the lupanar with the broader city while maintaining its own microcosm of activity. Every step, every glance, every coin exchanged contributed to the rhythm that kept this small world in motion. And then you think of the workers again. Most were enslaved, yet they exercised subtle forms of agency: a favored client, a whispered joke, a personal touch on a fresco, or a small token tucked away. These gestures humanized the daily grind, leaving traces that survive today. Even in a place designed for commerce, for transactions, for efficiency, individuality persisted. It thrived in the smallest acts of choice and expression. As you linger, you notice the layers of time pressing in. Ash from Vesuvius preserved this courtyard, freezing moments of life and commerce, laughter and fatigue. Every stone, every mark, every faint trace of color is a testimony to the people who lived, worked, and passed through here. In a sense, the courtyard is the lupanar's heart, a place where the ordinary and extraordinary collide. And where centuries of human presence remain palpable. Finally, you step toward the entrance, imagining the flow of daily life, the rhythm of footsteps, the shuffle of coins, and the laughter and whispers that once filled the air. The lupanar, frozen in ash, continues to breathe through its preserved walls, telling its story to anyone patient enough to walk its corridors, read its graffiti, and imagine the lives that unfolded here. You walk slowly toward the outer exit, the stone underfoot worn smooth by centuries. Lamplight fades as daylight fills the courtyard. Here, the cubicles, frescoes, niches, and graffiti settle in your mind, fragments of life preserved in ash. The lupanar was more than vice, it was commerce, survival, and routine. Coins passed hands, gestures set the tone, and the rhythm of daily labor persisted. Scholars debate its purpose: social hub, outlet, or business, but standing here, the layers feel inseparable. Sunlight softens the plaster, foot-worn grooves, and faint fresco outlines. Silence lingers, yet you imagine footsteps, laughter, coins, whispers. Even small details, a glance, a scribbled joke, speak of ordinary lives. It's a microcosm of Roman society: hierarchy, pragmatism, curiosity. Graffiti stands out: names, boasts, jokes etched in plaster, a diary in stone. You picture someone scratching a quick message 2 millennia ago, Pompeii's slow, permanent version of social media. You pause, oil and dust in the air, sunlight warming stone, shadows stretching across walls. The lupanar's walls and beds tell a story of routine, survival, and human expression, however small. One last look at the threshold, and you picture Pompeii's streets: sailors, bakers, merchants, soldiers, each leaving fragments of themselves here. The lupanar was not just about desire but ordinary life, preserved in ash, waiting for you to step into its rhythm. Lingering at the exit, let your thoughts slow. The cubicles, frescoes, and imagined coins fade like a distant melody. The courtyard lies in soft sunlight, shadows stretching patiently across stone. Breathe deeply, and recall the laughter, whispers, and gestures, now only echoes in plaster and graffiti. Let these traces merge into one tapestry of life, where even mundane acts endure, the air feels cooler. You sense the muffled streets outside. Vendors, sandals, a barking dog, blurred into stillness. Let the lupanar dissolve like ink in water, its noise folding into calmness, a testament to the ordinary and the human. A small smile forms as you recognize how people leave marks, absurd, tender, enduring. Imagine the sun dipping, shadows lengthening, Pompeii quiet and infinite in its patience. Now, dim the lights, listen to a soft hum, and let the imagery fade into dreams. Let ancient echoes become a lullaby, carrying you toward rest, curiosity, and the comfort that human moments, however small, survive.